Thank you, ladies and gentlemen from across the Louisiana plain. You have come to a place of truth and equipping and action. Thank you for joining us today in pursuit of honest governance, liberty, and to help us drain the Louisiana swamp. My name is Chris.
And I'm Danielle, and this is the State of Freedom. We are so grateful that you're spending part of your day with us today. Today, we will be diving into an issue that is essential to the future of our republic. This one issue determines whether we live free or devolve into a nation of tyranny. It's an issue that I know many of you are already very passionate about, as are we, and that is election integrity. But first, let's take a look at the scripture of the day. Today's scripture is Psalm 7, verses 14 through 17, and it says, "Look how the wicked conceive their evil schemes. They go into labor with their lies and give birth to trouble. They dig a pit for others to fall into, not knowing that they will be the very ones who will fall into it. Every pit digger who works to trap and harm others will be trapped by his own treachery. But I will give my thanks to you, Lord, for you make everything right in the end. I will sing my highest praise to the God of the highest place." And what a great reminder that is. And it was for me this morning, even as I was just thinking about what we were going to be talking about today. It's just a great reminder that the Lord sees everything. It can be so easy to get discouraged and to feel like what is true and right and just will just continue to be run over by evil. But the Lord sees it all. And he will let those who are planning and plotting evil become victims of their own schemes. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to seeing that happen. He will prevail, and he will make everything right in the end. So this is just an encouragement. Be encouraged. Get your hopes up. The Lord will not let the wicked triumph. He will have the victory.
He will have the victory, and the evil will fall into the pit that they have dug. I love that. That's such a great quote. And we are exposing some of the pits that are being dug. And one of the main influences with regard to exposing some of the pits involving election integrity is Dr. Randy Russ. And we're so thankful to have Dr. Russ here with us today. How are you, Dr. Russ?
Hey, Chris, I'm fine. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
So happy to have you today. Dr. Russ, you have been so involved on the forefront of this battle to secure our elections in Louisiana, and few know more and have done more research on the serious vulnerabilities in this centralized election system that we have here in Louisiana and in many places throughout the country. And I know we're going to get into that, but I thought we would start by giving our listeners a little information on your background and specifically how you got involved in this most important issue of election integrity.
Sure. I want the listeners to know that for my whole life up until November of 2020, I was politically aware but uninvolved. I was a registered independent. I've never given money to a candidate. I've never worked in a campaign. I focused on my faith, my family, and my business up until that point. And so, like many Americans, I assumed that everything was okay. And, I knew there were some problems here and there with elections. But on that night of November 3rd, as was my custom with my dad in the late 60s and early 70s, we would stay up and watch the election returns, which I've done my whole adult life. And many of your listeners, in fact, probably all of them, will remember at 10:40 at night, the counting stopped in 5 swing state major metropolitan cities like Atlanta, Detroit, etc. And when the counting resumed, allegedly, we went from a Trump victory to a Biden victory. And having studied statistics and system science, both in my undergraduate degree at LSU in industrial management and my PhD in marketing and economics, that statistically what we saw was impossible. And so that night, I stayed up till 2 or 3 in the morning. I went to bed. My dear wife, in the morning, we woke up and were having our coffee, and I started ranting and raving. And after a few days of that, she said, "Look, You either need to stop this ranting and raving or do something. And wanting to maintain my marriage of at that time 40 years, I figured I needed to shut up and get to work, which is what I've been doing since November 4th of 2020.
We're so grateful that you did. Now, Dr. Russ, would you mind just telling us a little bit about why election integrity is the most critical issue that we're facing in this country right now?
Sure. Everything that we're seeing from CRT to COVID mandates to open borders, those are all symptoms of a deeper problem. And those of us in the election integrity movement believe that if we correct and clean up our elections, that many of those issues will be addressed by persons who have been freely, fairly, and transparently elected. And we're grateful for all the people who are working on those issues because it's very important to shine the spotlight on them. But we think that unless we have free, fair, and transparent elections, we will not have a republic much longer. And so we will be subject to tyranny and oppression like we're beginning to see now, censorship being one example of that.
100%.
Yeah, one major example of that. So, Dr. Russ, hypothetical here. So, the average Louisiana voter gets up on election day, goes to vote, goes to a machine, casts his vote, sits down satisfied that his vote is being reliably cast and counted, and he can rely on that. What do you tell the average Louisiana voter who believes that the voting system in Louisiana is secure, is reliable, and accurately reflects the intent of the voter? What would you want to tell that Louisiana voter?
That's a great question, Chris, and we get it all the time as we speak and travel around the state. Why should I believe what you're saying? Well, I worked in business and industry for 30 years, and one of the most basic things that we do is audit things. The Department of Revenue audits our businesses, the IRS audits our businesses, and in my experience, the internal auditor and the chief financial officer of a major Louisiana company reported to me. So Ronald Reagan said one time, trust but verify. The problem with our electronic centralized voter registration and voting machine systems is they are not audited. And that's not me saying that. That is the Louisiana legislative auditor on page 5 of their March 22 report. They state that because there is no paper ballot, that Louisiana's election results cannot be audited. Now, by extension, they didn't say this. This is my conclusion. If they can't be audited, that means they've never been audited. So we do not have even the most basic reporting and auditing to determine if the black boxes that count our votes are actually accurate. And this would never be tolerated in a privately held company, and certainly not in a publicly held company where you have to match physical assets to what's in the electronic record. In the case of elections, that means having a paper ballot cast by a voter that's compared to the electronic record. So the fact that Louisiana has never audited the results of the election is a red flag, and in private industry, it would not pass muster.
And Dr. Russ, why is it, to drill down on that a little bit, why is it important that the electronic vote be auditable? Some people would say, well, the machines are perfectly safe. There's no reason to audit those machines. They cannot be manipulated or hacked. There's no reason to believe that the intent of the voter is not accurately reflected. Why is it important that there be an audit capability?
Well, because that verifies that the software programming is working properly. But forget corruption and potential manipulation. Citizens deserve to know that the software is operating and correctly counting. In addition to that, auditing is protection against fraud and theft. And we know throughout Louisiana, in local and parish offices, folks are caught all the time manipulating electronic records and stealing funds from the public. There was just a case in the West Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office where a person for years had been faking the books and stealing the ticket money, traffic ticket money, and she was able to do that because she had control of both the cash, which is the physical artifact, we say in auditing, and the electronic record, which was the accounting software. So because it was centralized and complex, this individual was able to steal $100,000+ from the citizens of West Baton Rouge Parish. And so this is a very basic idea, and it's puzzling to us in the election integrity movement why the state government officials and local officials, election officials, are so resistant to what is commonly practiced in almost every organization. And quite frankly, it suggests to us that there may be cover-ups going on they really don't want to know. And that's what this kind of behavior tells us in the private companies that I was in. If someone in management refused to be audited, that was prima facie evidence that they are involved in something nefarious. Because if your books are clean, right, you don't have anything to hide.
Exactly.
I'm not accusing anybody of anything other than to say that if you refuse and you make excuses for not auditing, it's at least a yellow flag, should be for citizens.
Without a doubt. And in the lead up to our discussion today, I was talking to my sister. She is in IT security, and she's at DEF CON, the big hacker convention in Las Vegas. And she reminded me that a couple of years ago at what they call the voter village at DEF CON, there were children that hacked into multiple voting systems, multiple Secretary of State websites and security systems. And I have a clip on the reporting from that 4 years ago that maybe we'll just play now, and I'd love to get your reaction to.
Sure.
Villages are rooms dedicated to one specific type of hack at DEF CON. So for example, there's an IoT village, there's a car hacking village, a Wi-Fi village, that's one of my favorites. There's even a lockpick village and a voting machine hacking village. They all exist under the convention umbrella. In this case, the voting machines were donated by organizers for attendees to analyze, attack, and infiltrate, and several stories from the weekend surfaced. For starters, after the first day of DEF CON, the convention tweeted that 39 children ages 6 through 17 attempted to hack replicas of the SOS websites for 6 swing states, with 35 completed the tasks. An 11-year-old did this fastest with an SQL injection in under 10 minutes. They were also able to deface the page and tamper with vote tallies. Diebold TSX voting machines were also running expired 2013 certificates, which made them vulnerable to many exploits. And since Diebold machines have easy-to-pick physical locks as well, one hacker was able to reprogram the machine to play back meme GIFs and music after upgrading it to Linux. Even poll book machines were hacked. They have easily accessible memory cards that could be replaced, so precinct records could be changed. Voters could be added and deleted, all within 5 seconds. And worse, poll book machines keep passwords on the memory cards for supervisors, and those passwords are in plain text. Alongside personal records on voters, including the last 4 of your SSN, your driver's license numbers, and a lot more. ES&S vote counter machines had active Ethernet ports which could expose them to hacks, and this is just in the first day of the village. And while so many hacks and exploits were had, the National Association of Secretaries of State rebuked the findings.
I just found that clip so stunning. Namely because it was 4 years ago. So that was in 2018. This was very much public knowledge that these voting machines were vulnerable at best.
That's correct. And you even have testimony from many, many senators in a hearing, including Vice President Kamala Harris, who was a senator at that time, and others, Amy Klobuchar, Ron Wyden, prominent Democratic senators, talking about publicly, and listeners can go find videos on this, about how vulnerable these systems are. And really nothing has changed since that time. And so just as we're finding out that the federal and state government has not been truthful with us and the media and social media about things like the Hunter Biden laptop and the COVID, all of the COVID issues, we're finding out that CISA, who said on November 12th, 2020, these were the most secure elections in history, and they had the National Association of Secretaries of State on that letter. They had the National Association of Election Directors on that letter, and so on. So what we're finding is that folks are not being candid with us. And that's a problem in elections too, especially in the area of voter registration and machines, election machinery.
Dr. Russ, talk a little bit about the connection between the the voter registration and the problems with our voter registration and the importance of cleaning up the voter rolls, the connection between that and the more general vulnerabilities and fraud to which our systems are vulnerable.
Sure. You have two sides of the coin here. You have voter registrations and you have voting machines. So in order to vote, someone must be registered. And that's the front end of the process. And so these systems, which used to be administered locally by parish registrar of voters and county registrars around the country, they have been centralized and outsourced to third parties who are owned by hedge funds. That's a minor point, but important to our discussion, because these companies are not subject to public disclosure laws. Louisiana's outsourced registration system is Civics, and it is owned by a hedge fund out of Indianapolis, Indiana. And so what's required in any kind of corruption is you need to be able to control the inputs and the outputs. So think about our example of the person in West Baton Rouge. She controlled the cash coming in from traffic ticket payments. She also controlled the reporting of the back end and the deposit of the funds into the bank. So because she controlled all those pieces of the process, she was able to make things line up. And that's essentially why, to corrupt the election process, it begins with counterfeit voter registrations. And so Louisiana citizens who are listening know that all of our private personal information was just hacked, including name, address, color of our eyes, height, social security number, driver's license number, etc. The Office of Motor Vehicle, which is served by the State Office of Technology Services, was hacked, and literally every piece of personal information for every Louisiana citizen was stolen. And that's not me saying that, that's publicly reported by the governor and other state officials. So here we have a highly vulnerable system at an office where voter registrations are done, Office of Motor Vehicles, that could not protect the personal private information of every Louisiana citizen that's in that database. That is shocking.
That is shocking. And along those lines, Dr. Russ, Dr. Haldeman has testified from the University of Michigan, one of the premier forensic experts in the world, said this about the electronic voting systems that are used throughout the country. I just want to read this quote to you and get your response to it. This was before the Louisiana Voting System Commission in 2021. And he said, universal use of ballot marking devices, those are the voting machines, is a major security challenge because if they are hacked, they can misprint or alter votes. He says they are large, attractive targets to hackers, making attacks more likely. And then he says the attackers that I worry about getting into the machines are the attackers like foreign governments and very sophisticated criminal gangs that are able to hack in often without even being detected by election officials. I read that and I found that very chilling, and that was the testimony that he gave before the Voting System Commission. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was there that day and heard him firsthand make those remarks. He has since, just within the last month or so, released the Georgia voting machine report, in which it's 90 some odd pages. It was held as part of a lawsuit between citizens against the Secretary of State in Georgia, alleging that their machinery was imminently hackable. For 2 years, the judge would not release the report, but there are 90 plus pages that reinforce the testimony that you just said. And what is most chilling and should be disturbing to every Louisiana voter is the same machines that are used in Georgia we use for early voting, the Dominion ImageCast machines, and that's 42% of our vote. And what Haldeman has said in the report is that state and local election officials will not even know that these manipulations and changing of votes have taken place. Dr. Haldeman has a PhD from Princeton University, which last I heard, that's a pretty good school. And he's a professor of computer science at University of Michigan and the foremost expert on electronic voting machines. And he has told the Voting System Commission, and he has told the Secretary of State, and he has produced report after report saying these systems cannot be trusted. So it's mysterious to us that our election officials in Louisiana would be pushing these machines onto voters in the state.
I was just going to say that it's remarkable that our election officials seem to just be willfully ignoring the evidence. But what would you say to listeners, to voters who say, well, our machines are not connected to the internet? That's something that I've heard come up quite a bit. And my understanding is it doesn't need to be connected to the internet in order to be hacked, but you would know a lot better than I do.
That's correct. The old machines, the day-of voting machines, use cartridges, like an old floppy drive, if you will. Those cartridges, and that's about 48% of our votes, those cartridges are taken to the clerk of court's office on election night, and they're uploaded into a Secretary of State database. The early voting systems, which is a Dominion ICX machines, those use thumb drives. And if you've ever had a computer, you know that thumb drives get corrupted, right?
Yep. So
those thumb drives are inherently insecure. On election night, those thumb drives are taken to, they're at the registrar of voters office. They're uploaded into the Secretary of State's database, results database. And then the early voting by mail, which is paper ballots, those which are 9.7% of the vote in 2020, those are scanned on a Dominion scanner into the Secretary of State's central database. Now, I'm a retired professor. I don't get to give pop quizzes very often, but I'm going to give y'all a pop quiz. So what central database just got hacked and every single citizen who's in the OMV database had all of their personal information stolen? Which system was that? I just gave you the answer.
It was at the OMV. It was all of our driver's license information.
So it's ludicrous to make the claim that a system is not connected to the internet, because all of these votes are put into a centralized system which can be hacked.
Well, and what you just outlined shows that there's many points for failure and corruption along the way. It's not necessarily just one particular point. It's not necessarily just you pressing the button at the machine.
Correct. And that's the nature of a complex system. Haldeman talks about this in his Georgia report, and he says there are at least 15 points in which in the Dominion ICX environment, which is what we use for early voting in the ROV's office, there are at least 15 points of threat where hackers can go in and modify votes. And he did it on 2 of those machines that he evaluated. So this threat is not theoretical. It's thoroughly documented, and voters should be very concerned about it.
And not only is it documented by and testified to by Dr. Haldeman, there are others. Andrew Apple out of Princeton, Richard DeMillo out of Georgia Tech, Philip Stark out of UC Berkeley. It seems like all of the premier forensic experts are all saying the same things as you are, that these systems are simply not trustworthy, which leads me to this question, Dr. Russ, if you would venture to answer it. Why the institutional resistance to acknowledging and conceding the vulnerabilities of our current system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that there are several reasons for it. One is elected officials don't like to look bad. I don't know if you've noticed this, but elected officials almost never admit mistakes. They obfuscate, they lie, they have handlers who try to smooth things over.
So true.
They are not candid by nature. And I'm not saying they're dishonest, but they have great difficulty confessing and repenting, to use Christian terms. Secondly, I think that they are hesitant because they don't want to have to answer the question, which goes like this. Well, Senator Russ, do you think you were fairly elected? And of course, Senator Russ would have to say, well, of course I was, but that other guy, that governor, or whoever, that guy wasn't fairly elected.
So true.
And I think thirdly, they don't want to look incompetent. And these systems are so complex that our registrar of voters and clerks of court, who do a great job following the procedures they've been given, but guess who wrote the procedures? The voting system companies. And guess who paid for much of the training that our clerks and registrars and Secretary of State personnel get? The federal government, EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, who has been implicated in the censorship enterprise, the Harvard Belfer Center, Mark Zuckerberg's Center for Civic and Technological Life, CTCL. All of those entities have been funding training for clerks and registrars and funding the National Association of Secretaries of State. So we have what I would call regulatory capture here, that the election industry has captured the regulators, which would be the Secretaries of State, the clerks of court, and registrars of voters. And they have, quite frankly, in my opinion, brainwashed them. And you'll notice if you talk to clerks of court and registrars of voters around the state, they all say the same thing. Trust the process, trust the process, trust the process. You just need to trust the process. And that sounds to me very familiar.
Yes, it
We've
does.
We've heard about the vaccines, and I know you guys have covered this. It's safe and effective. The vaccines are safe and effective. Well, they're safe and effective. They're safe and effective, right?
Trust the science.
Yeah, regardless of reality, trust the science.
So anytime you hear a group of, in this case, 64 individuals, well, 128 if you include registrars, all parroting the same lines, that's suspicious. Who is briefing them? Who is telling them what to say? And why aren't they open to looking at evidence of voter registration anomalies in Louisiana, which we've been working on for the last several years, looking at actual problems.
In which you and your group and other citizens in Louisiana have gone a long way in exposing. There was a bill, just parenthetically, this past session that would have required a supplemental annual canvass of all registered voters in Louisiana. And there is an estimate, Dr. Russ, and you can speak to this, that there are hundreds of thousands of voters, quote unquote voters, on Louisiana's voter rolls right now who are either dead or have moved out of Louisiana or have moved out of the parish in which they are registered. And if that is not a recipe for fraud in the system that's got to be addressed, I'm not really sure what is.
Well, you know, Chris, that we have conducted 2 physical canvasses, one in Terrebonne and one in Ascension Parish. We've also done a digital canvas, which is to look at every single registered voter in the state and compare their address, for example, against addresses, known residential addresses versus commercial addresses, just to use an example. And we have found estimated, and we have them by name, 600,000 plus voters that we believe do not meet federal and state law to be active registered voters. And we brought that to the attention of the Secretary of State's office going back, 2 years now, that we believe that there is problematic issues in our voter registration. And now we're at the point where 1st of May, a group of citizens sued the Secretary of State to clean up our voter rolls in the 19th Judicial District. So that came on the heels. I'm glad you mentioned that bill, because First Assistant Secretary of State Nancy Landry testified in Stefanski's committee, Representative Stefanski's committee, House Governmental Affairs, that they at the Secretary of State's office had identified 183,000 plus suspect registrations. So they admitted that. Meanwhile, on the election trail, on the campaign trail, Ms. Landry is stating that our voter rolls are 99.75% accurate. So we have a conflict here. And in business, we say, well, we've agreed that there's a problem. We just don't agree on the number. So the Secretary of State's office is admitting 183,000, including those who are over 120 years old. We're saying the number is 600,000. We made a polite request to sit down with them and talk about it after her testimony, and they didn't want to do that. So unfortunately, we had to sue them in the 19th Judicial Court to follow federal and state law that's already on the books, to contact voters who are suspected of being ineligible and moving them to inactive. And ultimately, if they don't respond, they are to be removed from the rolls. That is not my opinion. It's federal and state law. One of the interesting things that happened in our hearing with Judge Tobias, who's a retired judge, is the state moved to dismiss the case based on standing. And the judge said, well, my own daughter moved to California 20 years ago, and she's still on the voter rolls. And I looked over at the state's attorneys who are outside counsel, and they were crestfallen. I mean, you could see their faces go white, because we hear stories all the time. I have a very prominent senator who I talked to, and she said, my son moved to Houston about 15 or 17 years ago, and then he moved to New York about 10 years ago, and he's still on the voter rolls. So when we bring this subject up, public officials tell us about their friends and family who are still on the rolls, but they won't publicly admit it.
That's so remarkable.
Wow.
And just a question for you kind of along those lines, Dr. Russ. How many elected officials do you think are sitting in their seats wrongfully because of this debacle, this disaster that is our voter rolls? Not to mention the machines.
Yeah, I wouldn't venture a specific number, but I would give our fellow citizens this advice. If it looks like the public official is not responsive to the voters, let's just take the issue of crime. All of us, regardless of socioeconomic status, want to live in safe communities. And I would argue, as someone who worked in inner city Jackson, Mississippi at Jackson State University, folks of color who are in marginalized communities especially want safety and security. So whenever we see a set of public officials, the mayor, the district attorney, and the sheriff allowing crime to run rampant and to not be holding people to account, criminals, which we're seeing in cities, at least New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Shreveport, we're seeing that. That's a symptom, I believe, that those public officials may not be fairly elected, because no one would vote for increasing murder rates or increasing carjacking rates or increasing overdose rates from fentanyl.
Yeah. And they believe that they are willing to go along with that, or they're failing to address those issues because apparently they don't believe that they will have genuine accountability to worry about with real voters.
Exactly. And Chris, that's a great point, because if you see them acting unaccountable, it means that they know something's going on that protects them. And the ultimate accountability in a constitutional republic is our right to vote the bums out. And now we see them getting elected and reelected and reelected. And yet, I'll just use our major cities. Look at the deterioration in places like Chicago, our own capital, Washington, D.C., and here in New Orleans, we have a great example. And so when we see people who act unaccountable, that suggests that they have some assurances from somewhere that they don't have to worry about the voters, because clearly they're not serving the voters.
And it is so stark, the difference between leaders who really are trying to address the issues and those who are not.
Chris, what a great interview. I mean, that's so sobering. The problems are so many, but I really just think that it was such an insightful and helpful look into the issues with our voting registration system and our election system. What do you think?
Well, in order to resolve any problem, we have to have a clear understanding of what the problems are. And Dr. Russ clearly has that understanding. And he also has some great solutions. And we look forward to talking with him about those solutions on the next podcast.
Yes, absolutely. He will be telling us about the solutions as well as some actions that we as average everyday citizens can take to restoring election integrity for our state. And I just think that's going to be the really, really critical piece now that we understand what the problem is.
Absolutely. In the meantime, Danielle, I encourage our listeners and Louisiana citizens across the state to continue to support the state of freedom. Why don't you tell them how they can support our program?
Absolutely. Please visit us at freedomstate.us. That's our website. You can support us there through our Glow FM page, which is the page where you can donate, you can subscribe, give a monthly subscription. As we've been saying, we will never, ever, ever put a paywall between you and the truth, but any support you can give us helps us to keep this thing going, and we would be so grateful. Also, if you are a business and you're interested in advertising, just drop us an email at info@freedomstate.us, and we will be getting back to you with some options for advertising.
We are building, Danielle, a powerful voice for constitutional conservatism in Louisiana every day, getting bigger, growing broader. We are revolutionizing the way politics is done in Louisiana, and every day we are taking another step to preserve the state of freedom in Louisiana.
Yes, we are. Thank you so much, Chris. Have a great one.
You too.
Thanks for listening to The State of Freedom. To stay on top of all the calls to action we mentioned today, just check out the show notes for the episode. If you'd like to support the show financially, visit our website at freedomstate.us. If you'd prefer to give by mail, you can send a check to The State of Freedom, LLC at P.O. Box 861, Berg, Louisiana 70343. If you own a business in Louisiana and are interested in supporting our show by advertising, please email us at info@freedomstate.us. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit lacag.org, LACAG.org, or email Chris at chris@lacag.org. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe and share it. Give us a 5-star rating in the reviews. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you next time.